Two police officers thought they'd pulled over an easy target. They didn't realize that the man behind the wheel wasn't just another driver. He was the head of their entire department. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share where you're watching from in the comment section. Your support will help us bring you more meaningful stories like this. The quiet evening air was filled with the gentle crunch of tires against gravel as Julian Coleman, a composed and well-respected 48-year-old, made his way home along Sycamore Avenue. A seasoned leader known for his dedication to justice and his unwavering composure, Julian had just wrapped up a long but fulfilling day in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he had been meeting with community leaders. His black sedan, an unassuming vehicle that blended seamlessly into the quiet suburban streets, rolled smoothly under the glow of dimming streetlights. His thoughts drifted to the aroma of his wife's famous pot roast waiting for him at home, a comforting end to a day spent in service to his city. But the calm of the evening shattered as blue and red lights erupted in his rearview mirror, their piercing glow slicing through the darkness. A siren followed, loud and insistent. Julian's grip on the steering wheel tightened instinctively. He glanced at his speedometer. 29 miles per hour in a 35 zone. No speeding, no traffic infractions, and certainly no broken taillights. And yet, he was being pulled over. His jaw clenched for just a moment before he exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Stay calm," he murmured, signaling and easing his car to the side of the road. This was a drill he knew all too well, one he had preached to others in his community. Hands visible, movements deliberate, tone polite. Not because he had anything to hide, but because experience had taught him that perception often shaped reality in these encounters. The sound of boots crunching against asphalt reached his ears as one officer approached his window, flashlight in hand. The bright beam cut through the interior of Julian's vehicle, lingering a second too long on his face before scanning the dashboard and console. Another officer hovered near the rear bumper, his posture rigid, his hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon. "You in a hurry tonight?" The first officer's voice carried an edge of unwarranted authority, his tone dripping with suspicion. "No, sir," Julian responded evenly, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Just heading home." The officer's flashlight swept over Julian's face again before dipping down to his lap, then back up. "License and registration," he demanded, ignoring Julian's response altogether. Julian moved deliberately. "I'm reaching for my registration now," he narrated, keeping his movements slow. "My license is in my wallet. I'll retrieve it next." The officer didn't respond, but Julian noted the slight shift in his posture, a tightening of the shoulders, an almost imperceptible increase in tension. "You know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, though the question felt more like a formality than a genuine inquiry. Before Julian could respond, the officer continued, "You were swerving back there, crossing into the other lane." Julian frowned slightly, maintaining his composure. "With respect, sir, I wasn't swerving. I have a dash cam that can confirm that." The officer's expression darkened. "D-dash cam, huh? We'll be confiscating that for evidence. Step out of the vehicle." Julian blinked. The situation had escalated far too quickly and for no apparent reason. "Is there a problem, officer? I'm complying fully." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said, step out of the vehicle, now." A prickle of frustration ran through Julian, but he knew better than to resist. He unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly opened the door, keeping his hands visible. As soon as he was fully upright, the second officer moved in, gripping Julian's arm and yanking him roughly toward the patrol car. "Is this necessary?" Julian asked, his voice controlled but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." "Resisting, ha," the first officer sneered. "You want to play that game? Fine by me." The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around Julian's wrists, biting into his skin. His mind raced. This was more than a simple misunderstanding. This was profiling, plain and simple. And now, instead of heading home to his wife and dinner, he was being shoved into the back of a squad car like a common criminal. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Julian sat stiffly in the back seat, staring out the window at the darkened houses he had driven past 1,000 times. Porch lights flickered on, silhouettes of neighbors appearing behind curtains, peering through blinds. No one stepped outside, no one intervened. In the front seat, the two officers chatted casually as they hadn't just handcuffed and detained a man without cause. The younger officer, Daniels, glanced at Julian through the rearview mirror. "So, what's your story? Late-night drug run, or just looking to give us a hard time?" Julian met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm just a man trying to get home." "Yeah, sure," the other officer, Reed, scoffed. "We hear that all the time. Reckless drivers always have an excuse." Julian took a deep breath, reining in his frustration. Arguing wouldn't help him here. He knew the system, and at this moment it wasn't working in his favor. By the time they arrived at the precinct, the fluorescent lighting had cast an unforgiving glare over the sterile holding area. Daniels removed Julian's cuffs with a smirk, his movements exaggerated and mocking. "Welcome to our humble abode," he said, voice laced with condescension. "You're going to be here for a while." "Am I being charged with anything?" Julian asked, rubbing his wrists. Reed chuckled, exchanging a glance with his partner. "We'll let you know once we figure that out. Sit tight." The holding cell door clanged shut behind him, its echo lingering in the stark silence. Julian sat on the cold bench, his mind a storm of thoughts. For years he had worked to build a system rooted in fairness and justice, and yet here he was, at the mercy of the very abuse of power he had sworn to eradicate. What the officers didn't know, but were about to find out, was that the man they had just wrongfully detained was not only innocent, he was their boss. And this was far from over. Outside the dimly lit holding cell, officers Daniels and Reed leaned against a cluttered desk, exchanging quiet laughter as they thumbed through Julian's license and car registration. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the station, highlighting the smug expressions on their faces. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Daniels muttered, his voice tinged with disappointment as he scanned the documents for any discrepancies. Reed smirked, tossing the papers onto the desk with a flick of his wrist. "Doesn't matter. We'll find something. Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet." Inside the cell, Julian heard every word, his face an unreadable mask. He sat with his hands loosely clasped, his posture composed, exuding a quiet confidence that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances. He wasn't angry. Anger was a waste of energy. No, he was waiting, watching, calculating. He knew patience was a virtue, and in time, it would serve him well. Hours crawled by at an agonizing pace. The station buzzed with movement. Officers coming and going engaged in their usual routines. A few cast curious glances in Julian's direction, but none lingered long enough to recognize him. He had only been in town for 3 weeks, recently stepping into his new role. That anonymity, however, was about to end. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in streaks of soft orange and pink when the measured sound of approaching footsteps drew Julian's attention. The air in the precinct shifted as a woman strode purposefully toward his cell. Unlike the others, she carried herself with an air of authority, her presence demanding respect rather than seeking it. The polished badge pinned to her crisp uniform read, "Lieutenant Morgan." If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment one below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. She halted in front of the cell, her sharp gaze flickering between Julian and the paperwork in her hand. Her expression hardened. "What's going on here?" Daniels straightened slightly, stepping forward with an air of practiced confidence. "Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest." Morgan's brow lifted ever so slightly. "Reckless driving? Where's the evidence?" Reed, still leaning against the desk with his arms crossed, shrugged nonchalantly. "We haven't processed it yet." Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line as she turned her attention to Julian. "Sir, do you have any idea why you were stopped?" Julian stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression calm as he met her gaze. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have a dash cam that can verify my version of events." A tense silence filled the room. Morgan's jaw tightened as she shifted her glare back to the two officers. "You didn't review his dash cam?" Reed exhaled, exasperated. "We didn't get to it yet." Morgan took a measured breath before speaking, her tone sharp with controlled frustration. "Get it now. And Daniels, my office. Now." As the two officers slunk away, their bravado diminishing, Julian knew the tide was shifting. This was only the beginning. The metal bench beneath him was cold and unyielding, pressing against his back as he sat in the holding cell, watching the precinct's rhythm continue uninterrupted. The minutes stretched into hours, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of papers or the murmur of distant conversations. Though outwardly still, Julian's mind was anything but idle. He replayed the night's events with precision, dissecting every word, every unnecessary escalation, every abuse of authority. It was a stark reminder of the deep-seated issues he had spent years fighting to change. His new role as police chief had been a chance to reform from within, to instill accountability where it had long been neglected, and now, in a cruel twist of irony, he was on the receiving end of the very corruption he had vowed to dismantle. A sharp click of heels against the tiled floor broke his reverie. Lieutenant Morgan returned, this time holding a tablet. She stopped in front of the bars, tilting her head slightly as she regarded him. "We reviewed your dashcam footage," she began, her tone clipped but professional. "I've also spoken with the arresting officers. Let me be clear. This should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely." Julian gave the faintest nod, unsurprised, but still allowing her to finish. "I'll be releasing you immediately," she continued, unlocking the cell door. "But I'd like to discuss next steps privately." Minutes later, Julian found himself seated across from Morgan in her office. The space was sparse. No unnecessary decorations, no personal flourishes. Just a desk, a couple of chairs, and a small filing cabinet. It was a room meant for business, and that suited him just fine. Morgan leaned forward, lacing her fingers together on the desk. "I'll be filing a report against Daniels and Reed," she stated firmly. "But there's something I need to ask." She hesitated, her gaze scrutinizing him as though trying to piece together a puzzle. "Who are you? You're far too composed for someone who just spent the night in a holding cell over nothing." Julian leaned back slightly, a faint, measured smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant, but let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm." Morgan studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth in his words. Finally she nodded, though her expression remained contemplative. "Fair enough, but I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll hear of this situation." Julian merely offered a knowing glance. "No, Lieutenant, I don't believe it is." As Julian stepped out of the precinct, the early morning sun cast a golden hue over the quiet streets, its warmth brushing against his skin in stark contrast to the lingering chill of the long, harrowing night. The air smelled faintly of damp pavement and coffee from a nearby street vendor, but none of it registered. The weight on his shoulders had not lifted. It had only grown heavier. He didn't go home, not yet. Instead, he slid into the driver's seat of his unmarked sedan and steered his way through the slowly waking city, the hum of the engine a low, steady companion to his thoughts. His destination wasn't a place of solace, but one of duty. He pulled into his reserved parking spot at police headquarters and stepped out, his polished shoes striking the pavement with deliberate steps. As he entered the building, the cool, fluorescent-lit hallways felt strangely different, as if the very walls knew what had happened, what was still unfolding. His assistant, Anita, glanced up from her desk as he passed. Surprise flickered across her face before she quickly masked it with professionalism. "Chief Coleman, you're here early?" Julian stopped, meeting her gaze with a measured look. "It's been a long night." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet storm beneath the surface. He exhaled through his nose, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "Anita, I need you to prepare a briefing room. I'll be addressing the department this afternoon." There was no need for further explanation. She nodded, sensing the gravity in his request. "Of course, sir." He turned and entered his office, shutting the door behind him with a quiet click. The moment he was alone, he let out a long breath, rubbing his hands over his face. This wasn't just about him, never had been. This was about integrity, about the trust the public placed in him as their chief of police. The people of this city expected leadership, fairness, and accountability. He had spent years building that trust, and now, in the wake of last night's events, it was being tested. But before he could take action, before he could make his case, there was one more battle to fight, one last storm to weather. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread like wildfire, drawing not only concerned citizens but also reporters eager to dissect every moment of the proceedings. Though cameras weren't allowed inside, that hadn't stopped the local media from staking out the courthouse steps, microphones ready to capture reactions the second the hearing adjourned. Julian sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. Beside him, his attorney, Sandra Reyes, methodically flipped through a thick folder of documents and evidence. She was a formidable presence, sharp-witted, relentless, and known for her ability to dismantle weak arguments with surgical precision. If there was one person Julian trusted at this moment, it was her. Across the room, Officers Daniels and Reed sat with their department-appointed attorney. Daniels was visibly tense, his leg bouncing under the table, fingers drumming nervously against his knee. Reed, on the other hand, wore an air of smug indifference, arms crossed as he leaned back in his chair, as if convinced this would be just another procedural matter swept under the rug. The room quieted as the judge entered. A stern-faced man in his 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor, he adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the documents before him. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying through the chamber with authority. "We are here today to address the charges brought against Mr. Julian Coleman. Prosecution, you may proceed. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 2 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time." The prosecutor, a young man who seemed slightly out of his depth, rose from his seat and adjusted his tie. His voice was steady, but there was hesitation beneath the surface. "Your Honor, on the night in question, the defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane. Upon being stopped by Officers Daniels and Reed, he became uncooperative and resisted arrest." Sandra, who had been listening intently, barely suppressed a smile. She leaned slightly toward Julian and whispered, "They're walking right into it." When it was her turn to speak, she stood with the poise of someone who had been in this exact position 100 times before. Her voice was firm, unwavering. "Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, but are also a direct result of racial profiling and an abuse of power." She let her words hang in the air, scanning the room before continuing. "To prove this, I would like to present video evidence that directly contradicts the officer's statements." The judge gave a small nod. "Proceed." Sandra gestured toward the bailiff, who moved to dim the lights. The soft glow of the projector illuminated the courtroom, casting flickering images onto the screen. The dashcam footage played first. The room fell into a hushed silence as the video clearly showed Julian's car moving steadily within its lane, the speedometer holding a constant 29 miles, well below the speed limit. In the rear-view mirror of the footage, the officer's patrol car appeared. Without any apparent reason, its lights flicked on. No traffic violation, no erratic driving. Just a decision made in the shadows of bias. Then came the body cam footage. The courtroom watched as the officers approached Julian's vehicle, their demeanor aggressive from the start. Their voices crackled through the speakers, their hostility undeniable. And then came the damning moment. Daniels, barely audible, muttered under his breath, "Another one of them causing trouble." Reed chuckled in response, shaking his head. "Figures." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The weight of the truth, unfiltered, undeniable, hung in the air. Gasps rippled through the audience like a wave of disbelief, spreading from one side of the packed courtroom to the other. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances while the gallery buzzed with murmured reactions. The judge, a seasoned veteran of the bench, furrowed his brow deeply as he shifted his gaze from the flickering screen to the two officers seated at the defense table. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. Even the court officers, who were trained to remain neutral, seemed to stiffen in their seats. At the prosecution's table, Sandra Wells, a formidable defense attorney known for her unflinching pursuit of justice, paused the video at a critical moment. She stood, turning to address the jury directly, her voice steady yet brimming with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have just witnessed is the professionalism displayed by Officers Daniels and Reed," she said, her tone laced with biting sarcasm. She let the moment settle before continuing. "Now, let's fast forward to the arrest itself." The footage resumed, revealing Julian Coleman's calm and deliberate actions as he reached for his registration and license. His voice, measured and clear, narrated each movement, ensuring complete transparency. Yet, despite his composure and adherence to protocol, the officer's demeanor remained aggressive, their hostility intensifying with every second. The contrast between Julian's controlled behavior and the officer's escalating aggression was undeniable, and it hung in the air like an unspoken indictment of their conduct. As the video concluded, silence engulfed the courtroom. The weight of what had just been presented settled over the space, pressing down on everyone within it. Sandra turned back to the jury, her eyes scanning their faces as she spoke with unwavering resolve. "This is not merely an abuse of power," she declared, her voice cutting through the quiet. "This is a direct violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and prejudice." The prosecutor, a normally composed and articulate man, stood abruptly, clearly rattled by the turn of events. His expression betrayed his internal conflict as he struggled to regain control. "The officers believed they had probable cause," he offered, though his words lacked conviction. Sandra wasted no time in responding, her voice, sharp as a blade, sliced through his weak defense. "Probable cause based on what?" she demanded. "Driving safely? Following instructions? Or perhaps it was the color of his skin?" A low murmur rolled through the courtroom. The judge, sensing the rising tension, banged his gavel lightly but firmly. "Let's keep this focused," he instructed, though his tone held no rebuke. Sandra nodded, her demeanor softening slightly, though her determination remained undiminished. "Your Honor," she said, turning toward the bench, "before we proceed any further, my client has something to share with the court." All eyes shifted to Julian as he slowly rose from his seat. He adjusted his tie with deliberate precision before turning to face the judge. His gaze swept across the courtroom, pausing briefly on the two officers before settling on the bench. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet strength that demanded attention. "My name is Julian Coleman," he began, his words measured yet powerful. "I am the chief of police for this city. I was appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you've seen here today." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. Julian continued, his voice unwavering. I chose not to disclose my position earlier because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias or interference. And now it has. The reaction was instantaneous. Shocked murmurs filled the courtroom. Daniel's face turned a ghostly shade of pale, while Reed, who had worn a smug expression for much of the trial, suddenly looked as if the floor had been yanked from beneath him. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Julian wasn't finished. He turned back to the jury, his words carrying the weight of more than just his own experience. "This isn't just about me," he stated. "This is about a system that allows officers like Daniels and Reed to operate without accountability. That ends now." His final words hung in the air like an unrelenting storm, reverberating throughout the room. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal proceedings, it had become a crucible for change. Daniels and Reed sat frozen, their expressions betraying their realization that their unchecked authority had finally met its reckoning. The judge, recognizing the gravity of the moment, called for a brief recess to allow everyone to process what had just transpired. When the court reconvened, the shift was undeniable. The prosecution, recognizing the futility of their case, offered no further arguments. The judge, with a decisive nod, dismissed the charges against Julian Coleman immediately. But this was merely the beginning. As Julian stepped outside the courthouse, he was met with a wall of reporters, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward in anticipation. "Chief Coleman, do you have a statement about the case?" one called out above the clamor. Julian raised his hand and the crowd quieted, eager for his response. "This case was never just about me," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "It is about accountability. It is about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. As a police chief, I am committed to creating a department that values integrity and fairness. And as a citizen, I will continue to fight for justice." The media continued to swarm, but Julian didn't linger. There was work to be done. The fallout from the case was swift. Officers Daniels and Reed were immediately suspended pending an internal investigation. Public outrage grew as the damning footage spread across news networks and social media, igniting protests and calls for systemic reform. Community leaders rallied together, demanding greater transparency and more rigorous training for officers. The tide was turning, and for Julian Coleman, this was only the first step toward lasting change. Julian's leadership had always been strong, but after what happened to him, it took on a new urgency, one that couldn't be ignored. He wasted no time calling an emergency meeting, summoning every officer in the precinct to the briefing room. The atmosphere was tense as they gathered, murmurs of speculation filling the air. Julian stood at the front of the room, his posture rigid but composed, his expression resolute. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and had decided enough was enough. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 3 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. "What happened to me last night," he began, pausing to let his gaze sweep across the room, locking eyes with the men and women in uniform, was not just an unfortunate event. It was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem, one that has gone unchecked for far too long. And as long as I'm chief, I refuse to let it continue. A heavy silence settled over the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others sat still, waiting, listening. Julian continued, his tone unwavering. "Our job is to serve and protect, not to harass, not to intimidate, not to abuse the trust this badge represents. If you can't uphold those values, if you don't believe in the kind of policing that prioritizes justice over power, then this isn't the place for you. It's that simple." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. No one dared to speak. Julian could see the impact of his statement in the faces before him, some nodding subtly in agreement, others avoiding his gaze entirely. But the message was clear. Things were about to change. Over the following weeks, Julian made good on his promise. He didn't just talk about change, he enforced it. He implemented mandatory bias training for all officers, ensuring they confronted their prejudices. He put stricter oversight in place, reviewing use-of-force incidents with a level of scrutiny that had been sorely lacking. He created an anonymous reporting system, making it easier for officers and community members alike to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. It was only the beginning, but it was a start. At first, progress was slow. Trust once broken was not easily repaired. Some community members were skeptical, unwilling to believe that a few policy changes could undo years of damage. But little by little, a shift began to take place. Officers found themselves held accountable in ways they hadn't been before. Community meetings became more productive, with fewer voices filled with pure anger and more willing to engage in dialogue. It was far from perfect, but it was something. Months later, Julian found himself seated on a panel at a packed town hall meeting, facing a crowd that was no longer just angry. They were hopeful, expectant, waiting to see if real change was possible. One young man stood up to speak, his hands gripping the microphone tightly. His voice wavered, but his words were clear. "Chief Coleman," he said, his eyes searching Julian's, "what you went through. It could have been me. It could have been any of us. But you didn't just brush it off. You didn't just move on. You stood up, not just for yourself, but for all of us. Thank you." Julian nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent months pushing for reform, fighting resistance both inside and outside the department. But hearing those words, knowing that his actions had made even the smallest difference, made every battle worth it. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Julian said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It takes all of us, holding ourselves and each other accountable. It takes persistence, even when the road is long and difficult. But together, we can build a system that truly serves everyone." As the meeting concluded, Julian lingered for a moment, watching the crowd disperse. There was still so much work to be done. The fight for justice, fairness, and true accountability was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he saw something in the faces of those leaving the room. Hope. And now that fight is in our hands. The fight to demand better, to stand up when we see injustice, to hold those in power accountable. It isn't just up to Julian or the department. It's up to all of us. Because if we want change, we have to demand it. We have to fight for it. And together, we can build a world where justice isn't just an ideal, it's a reality.